Dmitry Ivanovich was the youngest son of Tsar Ivan IV, commonly known as Ivan the Terrible, by his last wife Maria Nagaya, and the only child that they had together. He was born on October 19, 1582, and the marriage of his parents had not been blessed by the Orthodox Church, who considered only 3 consecutive marriages to be legitimate, and Maria was believed to have been at least the 6th wife of Ivan the Terrible. Maria was not at all favored by her husband, who only a year after their marriage in 1581 had made the suggestion to Queen Elizabeth I of England that he would dispose of Maria and take Mary Hastings, a daughter of Francis Hastings, the 2nd Earl of Huntingdon, as his new wife. It is believed that the birth of their son Dmitry was what spared Maria from banishment from Ivan's court. Dmitry shared his name with his father's firstborn son to his first wife Anastasia Romanovna, who had died in infancy back in 1553 at less than a year old. Following the birth of Dmitry, a dimensional icon was painted, which depicts his patron saint, Demetrius of Thessalonica, in whose honor he was baptized. Dmitry was only around 15 months old when his father, Ivan the Terrible, died from a stroke while playing chess in March 1584. Ivan was succeeded by Dmitry's elder half-brother Fyodor I, who was the 3rd and last surviving son from Ivan's first marriage to Anastasia Romanovna. Even before Fyodor had his coronation ceremony on the 24th of May that year, Dmitry and his mother Maria had been exiled to the town of Uglich, situated on the Volga River. The infant Dmitry had been granted an income from the land, which supported both him and his mother, as Maria had not been granted any property in Ivan's will. In Uglich, both mother and son had been placed under the guardianship of the boyars, who were high-ranking members of the feudal nobility. The new Tsar, Fyodor I, had never been taken seriously as a candidate until the death of his elder brother Ivan Ivanovich on the 19th of November 1581. Ivan Ivanovich had been the second-born son of Ivan the Terrible and Anastasia Romanovna, and had been the tsarevich and heir to the ivory throne of his father until he was allegedly killed by him in a fit of rage. Ivan Ivanovich's relationship with his father had deteriorated in the years prior to his death, and only days before, on the 14th of November, Ivan the Terrible had subjected his pregnant daughter-in-law Yelena to a violent assault because he did not approve of the clothes she was wearing, with Yelena suffering a miscarriage as a result. Ivan Ivanovich had rushed to his wife's defense and confronted his father on the matter. However, this confrontation, along with the younger Ivan's alleged insubordination in demanding that his father grant him command of troops in the Livonian War, saw the elder Ivan accuse his son of inciting rebellion. Angered, Ivan the Terrible struck his son on the head with his scepter. Ivan's minister, Boris Godunov, who was present at the scene, tried to intervene but received blows himself. The younger Ivan fell, barely conscious and with a bleeding temple. For the next few days, the elder Ivan prayed incessantly for a miracle, but to no avail, and the tsarevich died on the 19th of November 1581. The death of Ivan Ivanovich left Fyodor as the new tsarevich and heir. However, Dmitry Ivanovich would be born less than a year after Ivan the Younger's death. Following the aforementioned death of Ivan the Terrible at his chessboard in March 1584, Fyodor was crowned Tsar and autocrat of all Russia at Dormition Cathedral in Moscow on the 31st of May 1584. Fyodor, however, was only the nominal ruler, as his late father's trusted minister Boris Godunov, who was also his brother-in-law, legitimized himself as Fyodor's regent, as Fyodor was sickly of health and diffident of temperament, and thus perceived as a weak ruler. Godunov's position at the Tsar's court was so significant that overseas diplomats sought an audience with Boris Godunov, as his will was law, and although Fyodor reigned, it was Boris who ruled. As well as this, Fyodor's wife Irina, who was the sister of Boris, reportedly surpassed her spouse in intelligence, education, and sophistication, and she quickly acquired influence over Fyodor, learning to navigate in court affairs. While exiled in Uglich following the accession of his half-brother Fyodor to the throne, the young Dmitry Ivanovich had his own court, and was officially a reigning prince of a principality which had been granted to him as a younger son of a monarch who was not the heir to the throne. However, neither the prince nor his mother received any real rights to the principality, except for receiving a part of the district's income which supported them in the absence of any material assets being left to Maria in her late husband's will. Legitimate power was concentrated in the hands of so-called service people who had been sent from Moscow under the leadership of Mikhail Betsigovsky. The real reason behind Dmitry's exile to Uglich may have been the fear that Dmitry either voluntarily or unwillingly could become the figurehead around which all those dissatisfied with the rule of Tsar Fyodor would rally. Giles Fletcher, who was the English ambassador to Russia during Fyodor's reign, commented on the precarious situation the Rurik dynasty now found itself in, where after the Tsar, who had no son, the only remaining male representative of the Moscow line of the Rurik family was the young Dmitry.
The Tsar's younger brother, a child of 6 or 7 years of age, is kept in a remote place from Moscow, under the care of his mother and relatives, but, as is heard, his life is in danger from the attempts of those who extend their sights to the possession of the throne in the event of the childless death of the Tsar. The nurse, who had tasted some food before him, as I have heard, died suddenly. The Russians confirm that he is definitely the son of Tsar Ivan, by the fact that at a young age all the qualities of his father began to be revealed in him. He, it is said, takes pleasure in watching sheep and cattle in general being slaughtered, in seeing throats cut when blood flows from it, whereas children are generally afraid of it, and in beating geese and chickens with a stick until they die.
On the 15th of May 1591, Dmitry was found dead in the Uglich Kremlin, and the circumstances of his death were unclear. He was only 8 years old. His throat was cut, and there were no witnesses. Russian chroniclers and later historians offered 3 possible scenarios of what could have happened. The first theory is that Dmitry was killed on the orders of Boris Godunov, with the murderers making the scene of the crime appear to look like an accident. This version of events was supported by a number of prominent 19th-century historians, such as Nikolai Karamzin, Sergei Solovyov, and Vasily Kluchevsky. However, critics of this version of events have pointed out that Dmitry was Ivan's son from what was at least his 6th and final marriage, and this marriage had not been blessed by the Orthodox Church, who considered only 3 consecutive marriages to be legitimate. Such circumstances could have discredited a potential claim of Dmitry's for the throne, and thus he was not a direct threat to Boris Godunov, and on this note, modern scholarship tends to exonerate Boris of any role in Dmitry's death. The second theory is that Dmitry managed to stab himself in the throat during an epileptic seizure, while playing with a knife. Such a theory was supported by historians such as Mikhail Pogodin, Sergei Platonov, and Ruslan Skrynyakov. The detractors of this scenario assert that since during an epileptic seizure the palms are wide open, the self-infliction of a fatal injury would be highly unlikely. The official investigation which was carried out at the time asserted that Dmitry's seizure came while he was either playing with a knife, or playing a game of swaika, a game in which a marlinspike is thrown to land in the middle of a metal ring placed on the ground at a distance. One way or another, it was believed that Dmitry turned towards himself while holding the knife or marlinspike and died due to a self-inflicted injury to the neck while falling forward during a seizure. A third theory which found support with some earlier historians was that Godunov's people had tried to assassinate Dmitry, but killed somebody else instead, which provided an opportunity for Dmitry to escape. Such a scenario explains the appearance of impostors, who were sponsored by the Polish nobility. However, most modern Russian historians consider the version of Dmitry's survival improbable, since it is hardly possible that the boy's appearance was unknown to his assassins. In Uglich on the 15th of May 1591, at 12 o'clock on Saturday, the cathedral watchman Maxim Kuznetsov and a widowed priest, by order of Dmitry's mother Maria Nagaya, sounded the alarm on the occasion of the death of tsarevich Dmitry. The bells gathered the townspeople on the cathedral square. Maria and her brother, Mikhail, adhered to the version that Dmitry was stabbed to death, and they were vocal in their convictions. Their loud claims caused public outrage, not only due to the fact that a child had died, but as the last remaining Rurik heir who could have been able to challenge the regency and growing authority of Boris Godunov, the death was seen as far too much of a coincidence. A violent riot soon erupted, and enraged citizens lynched 15 of Dmitry's supposed assassins, including the local representative of the Moscow government and one of Dmitry's playmates. In the aftermath of the riots in Uglich, the government sent trusted people to the city to investigate and punish those responsible. The investigative commission was led by the eminent boyar and Prince Vasily Shoisky, who would many years later reign himself as Tsar Vasily IV. In the course of the investigation, up to 150 people were interrogated, including Maria Nagaya, witnesses, some representatives of the clergy, along with courtyard and posad people. After a thorough examination of witnesses, the investigative commission concluded that Dmitry had died from a self-inflicted stab wound to the throat. Following the investigation, Maria Nagaya would be punished for her role in instigating violence and was forcibly tonsured as a nun and exiled to a remote convent. However, later, after the political circumstances had changed, Shoisky retracted his earlier claim of accidental death and instead asserted that Dmitry was murdered on Boris Godunov's orders. Dmitry Ivanovich was laid to rest in the palace church in Uglich, and promptly, though temporarily, forgotten. With Dmitry's death, the Muscovite line of the Rurik dynasty was doomed to extinction, and although Tsar Fyodor and his wife would have a daughter named Feodosia the following year in 1592, she would die in infancy less than 2 years later, and they would have no other children. At the end of 1597, Tsar Fyodor I fell seriously ill and died on the 17th of January 1598, at 1 o'clock in the morning. With his death, the Muscovite line of the Rurik dynasty finally came to its anticipated end. Fyodor was buried in the Archangel Cathedral together with his father and brother Ivan. The late Fyodor's now widowed wife Irina was initially suspected of having her own aspirations for the throne. However, she would voluntarily accept monasticism in a convent instead, removing her from contention. With this, an assembly of representatives of the nobility and clergy, the Zemsky Subware, met on the 17th of February, and took into account, among other things, Irina's recommendation, before unanimously electing Fyodor's regent and Irina's brother Boris Godunov as the new Tsar 4 days later. Godunov was crowned on the 1st of September 1598, and the members of the Zemsky Subware swore an oath of allegiance to him. The close quality that was characteristic of that time outweighed the distant kinship of the possible pretenders to the throne. No less important was the fact that Godunov had been ruling the country as regent on behalf of Fyodor and was not going to let go of power after the Tsar's death. Following the deaths of Dmitry and Fyodor, self-preservation as much as ambition led to Boris's rise to power. Had he not guaranteed his seat on the throne, the mildest treatment Godunov could have hoped for would have been a life of seclusion in a monastery. During the first years of his reign, he was both popular and prosperous, and ruled well. He recognized the need for Russia to catch up with the intellectual progress of the West, and he did his best to bring about educational and social reforms. He was the first Tsar to import foreign teachers on a large scale, the first Tsar to send young Russians to be educated abroad, and the first Tsar to allow Lutheran churches to be built in Russia. After the Swedish War of 1590 to 1595, he attempted to gain access to the Baltic Sea, and he also attempted to obtain Livonia by diplomatic means. Being the first non-Rurik Tsar, Godunov could not help but feel the precariousness of his position. He cultivated friendly relations with the Scandinavians and hoped to take a bride from a foreign royal house, thereby increasing the dignity of his own dynasty. In his suspiciousness, he began to settle personal scores with the boyars, and it would later come to disgrace and denunciations. Prince Mstislavsky and Vasily Shoisky, who both held potential claims to the throne due to the nobility of their families, were not allowed by Boris to marry, and in 1601, the Romanov boyars and their relatives suffered due to a false denunciation. The eldest of the Romanov brothers, Fyodor Romanov, the father of the first Romanov Tsar Michael I, was exiled to the monastery of St. Antonius, and tonsured along with his wife, who was likewise exiled. As well as this, their son and future Tsar, Michael, was also exiled to a monastery. From the point of view of the people of that time, an elected monarch was not equal to the hereditary monarch, who became the ruler by the will of God, and not by the will of man. During his reign, Boris Godunov continued to be blamed for the death of tsarevich Dmitry, and as a result, the destroyer of the Tsar's root and the autocratic exalter of the throne. The real situation did not correspond to what was desired, and the boyar elite would not fail to take advantage of this. The earliest traces of the future impostor can be found around the year 1601 in Kiev, where he appeared in the form of a young monk who came to venerate shrines. It is believed that it was here that the future pretender made his first attempt to declare himself tsarevich of Moscow. According to the Russian historian, romantic writer, poet and critic Nikolai Karamzin, the pretender pretended to be terminally ill and at confession revealed his royal origins. There is no reliable information to whether this is true, but according to the testimony of priest-monk Varlam Yitskoy, who did not believe the claims made by the impostor, the abbot of Kiev quite unequivocally showed the impostor the door. Following this, the impostor allegedly lived for a long time in the Holy Trinity convent in Derman, which was then the possession of Prince Konstantin Ostrowski. At the time, the Holy Trinity convent in Derman was host to a motley group of believers opposed to the Latin Rite, such as Orthodox, Calvinists, Trinitarians and Arians. Later, in a letter to the Polish king dated March 3, 1604, Prince Konstantin Ostrowski denied acquaintance with the future pretender, from which conclusions can be drawn that the pretender either tried to open up to the prince and was cast out, or on the contrary, tried to behave as inconspicuously as possible and not to be seen. The second scenario may be more probable since the next stopping point for the pretender was the town of Hoshcha. While there, the pretender appeared to have discarded his monastic garb, and studied Latin and Polish for 2 years at the local Arian school. In 1603, the young impostor appeared in the town of Bragin, which is situated in present-day Belarus. There the impostor entered the service of the Western Russian Prince Adam Wishnovietsky, to whom he showed himself to be a courteous, secretive, and reserved individual. There are several contradictory versions of how the impostor managed to convey to the prince the story that he was Tsarevich Dmitry, who had been saved by loyal boyars. According to one of them, the impostor fell ill or simply pretended to be sick and demanded a confessor. He allegedly revealed his royal name to the priest during confession and bequeathed after his death to Prince Adam Wishnovietsky the papers that were under his pillow, which were supposed to confirm his story. But the priest, without waiting for this, hurried to the prince and told him what he had heard, and the latter immediately demanded to see the paper. After studying them and supposedly making sure of their authenticity, Wishnovietsky hurried to the impostor and directly asked about his real name and origin. When confronted by the prince, the young man did not deny it and showed him a golden pectoral cross, allegedly given to him by his mother. In addition, a number of special signs served as a guarantee to the prince of the impostor's legitimacy, such as a large wart on the cheek, a birthmark above the hand and arms with different lengths. The prince, still unsure what to make of this story, paid for the best doctors, and eventually the false Dmitry was able to get back on his feet. It was in the town of Bragin where a defector from Moscow, who bore the surname Petrushka, arrived and assured the prince that he had once served in Uglich under tsarevich Dmitry. Legend has it that the impostor immediately recognized Petrushka and addressed him, after which, casting aside all doubts, Wishnovietsky furnished the false Dmitry with a level of luxury appropriate to his position. However, according to a different version of events, the prince did not distinguish the false Dmitry from the crowd of servants, and on more than one occasion, the impostor had to feel the heavy and irascible character of the prince. Allegedly, the prince was angry with the impostor for being too sluggish and punched him in the face before cursing him with obscene words. The impostor could not endure such treatment and bitterly reproached the prince for not knowing against whom he had raised his hand, and in the process revealing his alleged true identity. As well as this, there is yet another version of events, in which the false Dmitry revealed himself not to Adam, but to Konstantin Vishnevetsky, a prominent military and statesman of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when during a visit to the city of Sambir, which is situated in present-day Ukraine, and being part of Konstantin's retinue, he first saw his future wife Marina Miniszek, and inflamed with love for her and seeing no other way to achieve his goal of marrying her, he put a confession of his royal origin on a windowsill for her to read. Marina supposedly informed her father, the Polish nobleman and diplomat Jerzy Miniszek, of this revelation, who in turn allegedly informed Konstantin, and eventually the news that the rescued tsarevich had appeared in Poland became public knowledge. At the beginning of March 1604, the princes Adam and Michael Wisnowiecki, who had continued to take care of the impostor, brought him to the court of Sigismund III, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, in Krakow. On the 15th of March, Sigismund granted the impostor a private audience in the presence of the Apostolic Nuncio to Poland, Claudio Rangoni, during which he privately recognized him as the heir to Ivan IV, assigned him an annual allowance, and allowed him to recruit volunteers on Polish territory. In response, the impostor promised to return half of the land of Smolensk together with the city of Smolensk to the Polish crown after his accession to the Russian throne. As well as this, to attract the powerful Jesuits to his cause, the false Dmitry publicly converted to Roman Catholicism on the 17th of April 1604, and convinced the papal nuncio, Claudio Rangoni, to also back his claim. Following his conversion to Catholicism, the impostor addressed the Pope of Rome with a letter promising favor and help, but apparently its style was so ambiguous that the promise could be interpreted either as a decision to convert Moscow to Catholicism, or simply a willingness to grant it freedom on an equal footing with other Christian denominations. Subsequently, both Konstantin Vishnevetsky and Jerzy Miniszek, the father of the impostor's aforementioned future wife Marina, triumphantly accompanied the impostor on his return to Sambir. Upon his arrival in the city, the false Dmitry made an official marriage proposal to Marina. The proposal was accepted, but it was decided to postpone the wedding until Dmitry's accession to the Moscow throne. The support of both Jerzy Miniszek and his daughter Marina appeared to be motivated by a number of ambitious calculations. Jerzy was mired in debt and sought financial remuneration from his royal connections, and the diaries of his daughter Marina, along with a number of contemporary accounts, appear to depict an individual with a lust for power. On the 25th of May, the false Dmitry signed an agreement with Miniszek, according to which he undertook to pay him a large sum of money, not to constrain Marina in matters of faith, and to give her both Pskov and Novgorod, and these cities were to remain with her even in case of her infertility, with the right to distribute these lands to servants, and the right to build churches. Miniszek was also promised the lands of Chernihiv, with the exception of 6 settlements which were transferred to Sigismund III, and the lands of Smolensk were to be divided between Sigismund and Miniszek. With all this, It wasn't long before the news of Dmitry's miraculous rescue finally reached Moscow and alarmed Boris Godunov. In response to these developments, Godunov attempted to persuade Konstantin Vishnevetsky to extradite the impostor, promising to make territorial concessions in exchange. However, the deal did not materialize. Naturally, the question arose as to how Tsarevich Dmitry was able to survive, and who exactly took part in his rescue and escape to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The surviving sources speak sparingly about this, which may suggest that documents containing information on this matter were later destroyed. A version of events is given by Marina Miniszek in her diary, and this version is closest to how the impostor described his miraculous salvation at the Polish royal court and with Jerzy Miniszek in Sambir. Marina writes,
"There was a certain doctor with the prince, who was a native of the Vlach. When he learned of this treachery, he prevented it immediately in this way. He found a child who looked like the prince, took him to his chambers, and told him to always talk to the prince, and even to sleep in the same bed. When the child fell asleep, the doctor, without telling anyone, put the prince on another bed. And so he did all this with them for a long time. As a result, when the traitors intended to carry out their plan and break into the chamber, finding there the Tsarevich's bedroom, they strangled another child who was in bed, and carried off the body. After that, the news of the murder of the prince spread, and a great rebellion began. As soon as this became known, they immediately sent for the traitors in pursuit. Several dozen of them were killed and the body was taken away. In the meantime, seeing how negligent Fyodor, the elder brother, was in his affairs, and that he, Boris, the equerry, owned all the land, decided that at least not now, but one day this child would die at the hands of a traitor. He took it secretly and went with it to the Arctic Sea itself, and there he hid it, passing it off as an ordinary child, without announcing anything to him until his death. Then, before his death, he advised the child not to reveal himself to anyone until he reached adulthood, and to become a blackguard. Which, on his advice, the prince did and lived in monasteries."
In some ways, the story of salvation told by the false Dmitry is close to the life story of a real prince, his contemporary, who lived for some time at the Polish court, Prince Gustav of Sweden. Gustav had been sent to live outside of Sweden in 1575, at just 7 years of age following his father's dethronement, and found refuge in Poland where he lived in poverty and despair. The adventurous fate of Gustav, whose true origin is beyond doubt, could have served as inspiration for the story of the false Dmitry. Boris Godunov received word of the false Dmitry's Polish support and spread claims that the impostor was simply a runaway monk called Grigory Otrepiev. On what information this claim was based is uncertain. But the Tsar's public support began to wane, especially as the false Dmitry's loyalists spread counter-rumors. Several Russian boyars also pledged themselves to Dmitry, thereby giving themselves a legitimate reason to not pay taxes to Tsar Boris. The impostor, having gained the full support of the Polish Commonwealth, formed a small army of approximately 3,500 soldiers from various private Polish and Lithuanian forces. The false Dmitry's campaign against Moscow began under the most unfavorable circumstances. First of all, the summer, which was the best time for military operations, had been missed. After delays in gathering troops, it was only possible to march on the 15th of August 1604, and only by October to actually cross the border of the Russian Tsardom, when the autumn rains had already begun and there was impassable mud on the roads. Secondly, it was known from the Polish ambassadors at the Tsar's court that the Crimean Khan was preparing to attack the Moscow borders. In this case, the Russian troops would be completely shackled by the repulsion of the threat from the south. However, this would turn out to be a false alarm, as Khan Gazagirai, realizing that it would not be possible to take advantage of the suddenness of the attack, preferred to abandon his plan. Thirdly, the impostor's troops had practically no artillery, without which there was no point in storming such powerful fortresses as Smolensk or the capital itself. Also, False Dmitry's ambassadors failed to get help from either the Crimeans or the Nogais. Perhaps, taking into account the latter circumstance, the false Dmitry preferred to advance on Moscow in a roundabout way, traveling through Chernihiv. For his part, Tsar Boris, who did not take false Dmitry's claim to the crown seriously, was in fact taken by surprise by the invasion. In anticipation of the offensive, the impostor, not without prompting from his future father-in-law, launched an offensive in his favor, the center of which was the castle of Oster. From here, the false Dmitry and his followers reached the first settlement on their march to Moscow, the town of Morovsk. Here, the false Dmitry's spies, having sailed up by boat, scattered letters on the shore with an exhortation to go over to the side of the so-called lawful prince. It is possible that the inhabitants of Morovsk refused to resist more out of fear than belief that the Polish army was led by a genuine prince. In any case, the voivodes Ladygin and Tolokonov, who tried to organize resistance against the impostor, were tied up and handed over to him. In October, the false Dmitry triumphantly entered the town. The people of Chernihiv, who had first met the Cossack Polish army with shots, heard that Morovsk had surrendered, and decided to swear allegiance to the impostor. Meanwhile, following the example of Ladygin and Tolokonov, Prince Ivan Tatev attempted to organize resistance by locking himself in the castle with the remaining loyal archers. However, the Posad, which was an outer settlement typically adjoining a town or a Kremlin, was left in the hands of the rebels, as a result of which the Chernihiv people, together with a detachment of troops, stormed the castle and took Prince Tatev, along with Princes Shahavskoy and Vorontsov, as prisoners. The Posad itself had been plundered by Cossacks amid the turbulence, and the false Dmitry forced them to return in part some of the goods which had been stolen, but with great difficulty. Following this came the first serious obstacle in the impostor's march to Moscow, the city of Novorossiversky. It was here that a favorite of Tsar Boris Godunov, the boyar Pyotr Basmanov, was stationed with heavy reinforcements from Bryansk, Kromy, and other neighboring cities. Basmanov prudently burned the Posad so that the besiegers would have nowhere to hide from the November cold. Nonetheless, the siege of the city began in November 1604, but the Poles retreated with a loss of 18 men. This would be followed by a general assault, but Basmanov, who had received a warning in advance from his scouts in the enemy camp, had time to prepare and did not allow the wooden walls to be set on fire. As a result of this, the false Dmitry had his first serious quarrel with his army, reproaching the Poles for being unable to match the military strength of the Muscovites. At this point, the Polish army was indignant, putting the entire enterprise on the verge of failure. However, the impostors' campaign would be saved by the surrender of the city of Putyvl, which was a stone fortress and a vital pillar for the Muscovites. On the 21st of December 1604, a major battle took place near Novorossiversky between the impostors' forces and the army of Prince Mstislavsky, in which, despite the superiority of the Tsar's army in numbers, the impostor won. It is possible that the defeat of the Russian troops was caused not so much by a military as by a psychological factor, as ordinary soldiers may have been reluctant to fight against someone who, in their opinion, could be the legitimate tsarevich. Some voivodes even expressed their feelings out loud that it was wrong to fight against a true sovereign, and according to eyewitnesses, the false Dmitry shed tears when he saw his compatriots killed on the battlefield. But even after this victory, the position of the impostor was far from being determined. The treasury seized in Putyvl turned out to be almost completely spent. The mercenary army grumbled, dissatisfied with the fact that the promised pay was paid to them only for the first 3 months, as well as the prohibition of robbery and exactions from the population. On the 1st of January 1605, an open mutiny broke out, and a mercenary army rushed to rob a wagon train which was transporting goods nearby. The false Dmitry personally rode around the knights, fell on his knees before them and pleaded with them to stay with his campaign, but he received insults in response and, among other things, a wish from a Polish soldier to see him publicly impaled. According to the memoirs of contemporaries, the impostor, unable to stand such an insult, hit the Polish soldier who insulted him in the face. However, other mercenaries at the scene managed to wrestle off the impostor's fur coat, which later had to be ransomed. Following this, most of the mercenaries began to leave in the direction of the border. As well as this, the impostor burned the camp near Novorossiversky and retreated to Putyvl. On the 2nd of January 1605, Jerzy Mniszek, worsening the already difficult situation of his future son-in-law, announced his departure to return to the Sejm, which was the lower house of the parliament of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is believed that Mniszek hoped for a noble uprising against Boris in Moscow and felt uncomfortable in the impostor's camp, where the Cossacks were gaining more and more power, and in addition to this, a number of prominent boyars in Moscow had sent him a letter full of undisguised threats. However, Mniszek assured the impostor that he would defend his cause at the royal diet and would send new reinforcements from Poland. On the 2nd of January 1605, Jerzy Mniszek, worsening the already difficult situation of his future son-in-law, announced his departure to return to the Sejm, which was the lower house of the parliament of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is believed that Mniszek hoped for a noble uprising against Boris in Moscow and felt uncomfortable in the impostor's camp, where the Cossacks were gaining more and more power, and in addition to this, a number of prominent boyars in Moscow had sent him a letter full of undisguised threats. However, Mniszek assured the impostor that he would defend his cause at the royal diet and would send new reinforcements from Poland. About 4 more Poles, including Colonel Adam Julitsky and Captain Stanislav Mniszek, went with him. In the end, between 800 to 1500 Polish knights remained, choosing an individual named Dworzecki as their leader instead of Mniszek, and the impostor was largely helped by the Jesuits, who sided with him at this critical moment. At the same time, other cities and settlements followed the example of Putyvl, among them Rilsk, Kursk, Sievsk, and Kromy. At the same time, the impostor ordered the miraculous icon of the Mother of God to be brought to him from Kursk, arranged a solemn meeting for it, and placed it in his tent, where he later prayed to it every evening. The commanders of the surrendered cities either swore allegiance to the false Dmitry themselves or were taken bound to his camp, where they would take the oath before being released. Dmitry's army would constantly grow and would be further reinforced by the arrival of over 1,000 Don Cossacks, who were fortified with the impostor in the town of Sievsk. Boris Godunov's Muscovite army, sent against the impostor, overtook him at the end of January near the village of Dobrun. On the night of the 21st of January 1605, the scouts sent by the false Dmitry intended to set fire to the village from different sides. However, this maneuver failed, and early the next morning, leaving the settlement, he gave battle to the Tsar's army, but was defeated by the numerous artillery of the enemy. As a result of the battle, the impostor lost almost all of his infantry and most of his cavalry. The Muscovites captured all his artillery, including 30 cannons, along with 15 banners and standards. The impostor's horse was wounded, and he was lucky to have escaped capture in the aftermath of the battle. For their part, the government troops unleashed a brutal reign of terror, killing indiscriminately all men, women, the elderly, and even children as sympathizers of the impostor. As a result of this, there was a general bitterness and schism among the Moscow nobility, which had previously been largely loyal to the Godunov dynasty. Time was also lost, as the impostor was allowed to leave and fortify himself for the whole winter and spring of 1605 in Putyvl under the protection of Cossacks. It is believed that the false Dmitry lost heart and tried to flee to Poland following this defeat, but the army managed to hold him, and soon his ranks were replenished by another 4,000 Cossacks. The impostor sent these reinforcements to defend Kromy, hoping in this way to distract Godunov's army, and until the spring this small detachment tied down the troops sent against the false Dmitry, who instead of besieging the impostor in his temporary capital, lost time storming Kromy and Rilsk, the inhabitants of which, having witnessed the bloody terror unleashed by the Tsar's troops, stood to the last. During this time in Putyvl, the false Dmitry was preparing for his future reign. He received Polish and Russian priests, addressed the people with promises to build a university in Moscow and to invite educated people from Europe to Russia, among other things. It was noted that both Orthodox and Catholic clergy were equally present at his dinners, and the false Dmitry did everything in his power to bring them closer together. By order of Boris Godunov, several monks were sent to Putyvl with poison for the impostor, but they were exposed and arrested. After the sudden and unexpected death of Boris Godunov in April, who had collapsed and died only hours after his physicians had observed him as being cheerful and healthy at the age of 52, the army stationed near Kromy swore allegiance to the impostor in May, and Voivod Pyotr Basmanov went over to the side of the false Dmitry and later became one of his closest associates. As well as this, the Chudov monks, who had been sent to Putyvl to denounce the impostor, sent a letter in which they called him the true son of Ivan the Terrible. Completely bewildered, Boris Godunov's widow, Tsarina Maria Grigorievna, and her advisors considered it best to stop mentioning the name of Grigory Otrepyev and to include in the oath to her son, the new Tsar Fyodor II, a promise not to support anyone who calls himself the tsarevich. Godunov's widow was extremely unpopular with the people, and rumors spread in the capital about her extreme cruelty. In one example, it was said that when Boris Godunov summoned Dmitry's mother Maria Nagaya to Moscow and tried to get her to tell the truth about what had happened to her son, Maria Grigorievna, infuriated by the silence of the former Tsarina, tried to burn her eyes with a candle. The impostor sent an army to Moscow, led by Prince Vasily Galitzin, and he himself traveled to Orel, where the electors from the entire Ryazan land were waiting for him, and then to Tula. Gavrila Pushkin and Naum Playsheva were sent to Moscow with a letter from Tsarevich Dmitry, probably under the protection of the Cossack detachment of Ivan Kurila. On the 1st of June 1605, Gavrila Pushkin, standing on the Lobny Meshta, read the letter from the impostor, addressed to both the boyars and the people of Moscow. The elderly Patriarch Job of Moscow tried to resist the messengers of false Dmitry, but nonetheless the Muscovites, with the connivance of the boyar government, arrested Tsar Fyodor II, his mother and sister Xenia in the Kremlin. The false Dmitry was proclaimed the new Tsar under the name of Dmitry Ivanovich. Together with the royal family, members of the extended Godunov family were arrested, as well as their relatives Saburov and Veleminov. That same day, the elderly Prince Vorotinsky and several minor boyars traveled to Tula. These included the Princes Trubetskoy, Telechevsky, and Sheremetev, along with Duma clerk Vlosyov and several nobles, clerks and guests. The impostor, angered by the fact that these messengers apparently had no power, allowed them to be brought to his hands later than the Cossacks who had arrived on the same day, and then punished them as if he were the legitimate son of the Tsar. However, the impostor could not trust Belsky as he was a relative of the Godunov family, and he soon replaced him with Vasily Galitzin, who had been sent from Tula. In Tula, the false Dmitry was engaged in state affairs like a legitimate Tsar. He sent out letters announcing his arrival, drew up the text of the oath, invited the English ambassador, who was returning from Moscow with letters, talked with him graciously, and even promised the same liberties that his so-called father, Ivan the Terrible, had once granted. As well as this, he received elected representatives from all the land and finally, the second boyar embassy headed by the three Shoisky brothers and Fyodor Mstislavsky. At first, the impostor treated them rather coldly, reproaching them that the common people were ahead of the courtiers, but in the end he changed his anger to mercy and led them to the oath, which was taken by Archbishop Ignatius of Ryazan and Murom, whom he expected to replace the resisting Patriarch Job. Vasily Galitzin and Prince Rubits-Masalsky were sent from the impostor's camp to Moscow with an order that the enemies of the tsarevich be eliminated from Moscow. It is speculated that this charter may have provoked the Moscow people to murder the deposed Tsar Fyodor II and his mother Maria Grigorievna. According to Konrad Busov's Moscow Chronicle, the impostor, who was now in the city of Serpukhov, made the liquidation of the Godunov family a condition under which he agreed to come to Moscow. Moreover, this order was not a secret, and was conveyed to Muscovites in an open message. Shortly before the false Dmitry's entry into Moscow, the deposed Tsar and his mother were strangled or stabbed to death in their Kremlin home. Supposedly, after the arrest of Patriarch Job, Vasily Galitzin, in the company of Mosolsky and the clerks Molchanov and Sherifedinov, was ordered to kill Fyodor II. However, according to Swedish diplomat and envoy to Muscovy Peter Petrius, who was in Moscow at the time, the direct perpetrator of the murder was the squire Ivan Bogdanov, who was allegedly secretly sent to Moscow for this purpose. Fyodor II was a sturdy and strong young man who put up a fight, and 4 men struggled with him. It was officially announced that Fyodor II and his mother had been poisoned. However, their bodies, which were on public display, bore the marks of struggle and a violent death. Petrius, who had seen the bodies for himself, claimed that the marks of the rope with which they were strangled were clearly visible. The bodies of Fyodor II, his mother Maria Grigorievna, and his father Boris Godunov were buried by order of the false Dmitry without any honors. However, they would later be reburied in later years under the reign of Vasily IV. The property of the Godunovs was expropriated and taken into the treasury. An extended member of the family named Stepan Godunov was killed in prison, and the rest of the Godunovs were sent into exile to the lower Volga region and Siberia. As well as this, the second cousin of Boris Godunov, Semyon Godunov, was sent to the town of Peroslavl-Zaleski, where it was rumored that he was starved to death. In public, the false Dmitry expressed regret over the death of the Godunovs and playing along with the narrative that they had committed suicide by taking poison, promised to pardon all the surviving members of their family. In Serpukhov, a magnificent tent that could accommodate several hundred people, the Tsar's kitchen and servants were prepared for the future Tsar. In this tent, the false Dmitry gave his first feast to the boyars and Duma clerks. Following this, he then advanced to Moscow in a rich carriage, accompanied by a magnificent retinue. In the village of Kolomensk, southeast of the city of Moscow, a new tent was erected on a wide meadow and a feast was again given to the aristocrats accompanying him. It is said that the impostor also kindly received delegations of local peasants and Posad people, who greeted him with bread and salt, and he promised to be a father figure to them. Waiting for the right moment and coordinating all the details with the Boyar Duma, the impostor spent 3 days at the gates of the capital. Finally, on the 20th of June 1605, to the festive ringing of bells and the cheers of crowds crowded on both sides of the road, the false Dmitry entered Moscow. According to the memoirs of his contemporaries, he appeared on horseback, in clothes decorated with gold, in a rich necklace, on a magnificently decorated horse, accompanied by a retinue of boyars. In the Kremlin, the clergy were waiting for him with icons and banners. However, the strict zealots of orthodoxy did not immediately like the fact that the new Tsar was accompanied by Poles, who who played trumpets and beat kettle drums during church singing. Having first prayed in the Kremlin Cathedral of the Assumption and the Archangel, the impostor shed tears at the coffin of Ivan the Terrible. But again, it did not go unnoticed that foreigners entered the cathedral with him, and the Tsar himself did not venerate the images in a manner which was appropriate for a Tsar of Russia. However, these minor inconsistencies were attributed to the fact that Dmitry had lived in a foreign land for too long and may have forgotten Russian customs. Those close to the impostor hurried for him to be formally crowned Tsar of all Russia, but he insisted on first meeting with his so-called mother, Maria Nagaya, who was the mother of the legitimate tsarevich Dmitry. In monasticism, Maria Nagaya bore the name of Martha, and she famously legitimized the impostor by identifying him as her son. Her motivations for doing so remain unclear. However, one could speculate that she may have felt she had been a victim of an injustice who had been unfairly punished. The impostor's second meeting was with Prince Mikhail Vasilyevich Skopyan-Shoysky, to whom the new Tsar granted the Polish title of swordsman. On July the 18th, Maria Nagaya held a public meeting with her so-called son in the village of Tyenskaya near Moscow in front of a huge number of people. According to the memoirs of contemporaries, the false Dmitry jumped off his horse and rushed to the carriage, and Maria, throwing back the side curtain, took him into her arms. Both of them were weeping, and all the rest of the way to Moscow Dmitry walked alongside Maria's carriage. Following this, Tsarina Maria was placed in the Ascension monastery in the Kremlin, where the Tsar visited her every day and asked for her blessing after every major decision he made. Only a few days later, a plot to overthrow and murder the false Dmitry was uncovered in Moscow. According to the denunciation of a merchant named Fyodor Konyev, it was revealed that Prince Vasily Shoysky was plotting against the new Tsar, and spread rumors that the new Tsar was the aforementioned Grigory Otrepyev, who was a monk and clerk of the Tsardom monastery in the Moscow Kremlin, who at one time performed secretarial duties under Patriarch Job. There are vague hints in the documents that soon after entering Moscow, the impostor ordered the arrest and death of several monks of the Tsardom monastery, as they could recognize him. However, the documents reporting this were drawn up after his overthrow and therefore do not inspire complete confidence. Shoysky also claimed that the false Dmitry was plotting the destruction of churches and the eradication of the Orthodox faith. Shoysky was soon captured, but the impostor Tsar left the decision of his fate in the hands of the Zemsky Subware, the aforementioned assembly of representatives of the nobility and clergy. According to the surviving documents, the Tsar was eloquent, and skillfully leveled accusations against Shoysky, which led to the council unanimously sentencing the traitor to death. On the 25th of July, Shoysky was raised to the chopping block to be beheaded, but by a formal order of Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich, he was pardoned and sent into exile. However, the nobleman Pyotr Turgenev and the merchant Fyodor Kalachnik were executed. The latter of whom reiterated his allegations that the new Tsar was an impostor all the way to the chopping block itself. The day before, on the 24th of July, Archbishop Ignatius of Ryazan had been elevated to the rank of Patriarch of Moscow. Soon after this, on the 30th of July, the impostor was formally crowned with Godunov's crown, having received it from the hands of the new patriarch Ignatius. The boyars presented him with a scepter and an orb. The royal palace was decorated in accordance with the event. The path from the Assumption Cathedral was covered with gold-woven velvet. When the Tsar appeared on the threshold, the boyars showered him with a rain of gold coins. Following his coronation, the new Tsar's first acts were the granting of numerous favors. The boyars and princes who had fallen out of favor under Boris and Fyodor Godunov were returned from exile, and their confiscated estates were returned to them. Vasily Shoisky had been pardoned yet again, this time from his exile after just 5 days, and was allowed to return to Moscow. As well as this, any remaining members of the Godunov family who still remained were pardoned, along with Fyodor Romanov, the future Patriarch Filaret of Moscow, as well as the rest of the Romanov family, the future Imperial House of Russia. Romanov himself was elevated to the rank of Rostov Metropolitan. The salaries of the servicemen were doubled, and the landlords were given land allotments, all at the expense of land and money confiscations from the monasteries. In the south of the country, the collection of taxes was abolished for 20 years, and the practice of cultivating tithe arable land was stopped. However, the new Tsar needed money for wedding payments and gifts, along with rewards for his supporters. Following the coup, many boyars were paid double salaries, as well as for the upcoming campaign against the Turks. Therefore, in other parts of the country, the amount of tax collections increased significantly, which led to the beginning of unrest. The new Tsar, unable or unwilling to act by force, made concessions to the rebels, and the peasants were allowed to leave their landlord if he did not feed them during the Russian famine of 1601 to 1603. Boris Godunov's decree had previously entrusted the lords with the duty to feed their servants in lean and hungry years. Although the economic situation of the country had improved, it was still characterized by instability, and realizing this, the false Dmitry tried to remedy the situation by imposing a natural tribute, called the Yisak, on the Siberian Ostyaks and Tatars. Bribery was prohibited by law, and the term of persecution of fugitives was set at 5 years. All peasants who fled a year before or after the famine years, or those who fled during the famine, taking their property, were to be returned. Those who fled during the famine were assigned to a new landlord, who fed them in difficult times. The law did not include those who managed to move more than 200 versts, or 21,336 meters from their former place of residence. Putyville, a city which had rendered great services to the impostor, was exempted from all taxes for 10 years, but the Consolidated Code of Law, which was supposed to include new laws, was not completed. In order to reduce abuses in the collection of taxes, the false Dmitry obliged the lands themselves to send the corresponding amounts to the capital with elected people. Bribe-takers were ordered to be led around the city, with money, furs, pearls, or even salted fish hanging around their necks and beaten with sticks. The nobles were spared corporal punishment, but had to pay heavy fines for the same crimes. The new Tsar changed the composition of the Duma, introducing representatives of the highest clergy as permanent members, and henceforth ordered the Duma to be renamed the Senate. During his short reign, the Tsar attended meetings almost daily and participated in the disputes and decisions of state affairs. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, he gave audiences, received petitions, and often walked around the city, communicating with artisans, merchants, and ordinary people. The false Dmitry's secret chancellery consisted exclusively of Poles, and this secret office was responsible for the Tsar's personal expenses and whims, as well as religious matters. The introduction of foreigners and people of other faiths into the royal palace, as well as the fact that the Tsar established a foreign guard under his person, which was supposed to ensure his personal safety, removing the Russian Tsar's guard, outraged many people. The English, who were in Moscow at that time, noticed that no other European state had ever known such freedom. In most of his actions, some modern historians recognize the false Dmitry as an innovator who sought to Europeanize the state. At the same time, Dmitry began to plan a war with the Turks, intending to strike at Azov and annex the mouth of the Don to the Russian Tsardom, and ordered new mortars, cannons, and rifles to be cast at the cannon yard. He himself taught the archers cannon-making and storming earthen fortresses, and, according to the memoirs of his contemporaries, he climbed the ramparts, despite the fact that he was unceremoniously pushed, knocked down and crushed. In the same winter, having enlisted the help of the Don army, he sent the nobleman Akinfov to Yelets with an order to strengthen the Yelets Kremlin. Siege and field artillery were also sent there, and warehouses for equipment and food were created. On the Verona River, a tributary of the Don, ships were ordered to be built. An embassy was sent to Crimea with a declaration of war. Dmitry himself was going to go to Yelets in the spring and spend the whole summer with the army. Voivodes were sent to the districts to conduct noble reviews. Part of the Novgorod militia, which consisted of nobles and boyar children, was summoned to Moscow for a campaign against Azov. At the same time, the false Dmitry began to look for allies in the West, especially from the Pope and the Polish king, and it was planned to include the German emperor, the French king, and the Venetians in the proposed alliance. This and the recognition of him as the so-called Emperor of Moscow were the focus of the impostor's diplomatic activities. But he never received serious support because of his refusal to fulfill his earlier promises to cede land and support the Catholic faith. He told the Polish ambassador that he could not make territorial concessions to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as had been promised, but instead offered to repay the aid with money. Jesuits were also denied entry, and if Catholics were indeed granted freedom of religion, this was also done for Christians of other denominations, particularly Protestants. Plans for war against Sweden also did not materialize, possibly due to the resistance of the Duma boyars. In December 1605, according to the memoirs of the Polish hetman Jolkiewski, the Swede Peter Petrius was sent to Poland with a secret commission to inform Sigismund about Dmitry's imposture and thus finally leave him without the help of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There is an opinion that Petrius verbally conveyed to the king the confession of Maria Nagaya, who had grown cold to the impostor after he ordered the secret destruction of the legitimate Dmitry's grave in Uglich. But this is only a supposition. It is well known that Petrus carried out his commission, but the king, maintaining his composure, forbade him to divulge such information on pain of death. Soon after Petrus, the boyar's son Ivan Bisabrasov arrived in Warsaw with the same commission. His mission was also facilitated by the fact that the impostor had once maintained relations with magnates who were dissatisfied with Sigismund III himself, among others, with the Krakow voivode Mikolai Zebrzydowski, the Stadnickis who were relatives of Mniszek, and others, who offered the Polish crown to the false Dmitry himself. Undoubtedly, this factor also played a role. At the same time, the Swedish support for the false Dmitry was unconditional. But it was strictly tied to their confirmation of the trade treaty of 1595, which was unfavorable for Russia. One of the false Dmitry's weaknesses was women, including the wives and daughters of the boyars, who actually became the Tsar's voluntary or unwitting concubines. Among them was even Boris Godunov's daughter Xenia, who, because of her beauty, the impostor spared during the extermination of the Godunov family, before keeping her with him for several months. Later, on the eve of Marina Mniszek's arrival in Moscow, Dmitry exiled Xenia to the Vladimir monastery, where she was tonsured under the name of Olga. In the convent, according to unreliable rumors, she gave birth to a son. On one hand, the false Dmitry was popular with the people. However, on the other hand, they suspected him of being an impostor. In the winter of 1605, a Chudov monk was arrested, who publicly declared that Grigory Otrepyev was sitting on the throne instead of Dmitry Ivanovich, whom he himself apparently taught to read. The monk was tortured, but having achieved nothing, he was drowned in the Moskva River along with several of his comrades. In the spring of 1606, it became known that an army of rebellious Cossacks led by Ileka Moramets, who pretended to be the never-existing tsarevich Pyotr Fyodorovich, the supposed grandson of Ivan the Terrible, was coming to Moscow from the Don. From Moscow, the nobleman Tretiak Yurlov was sent to the insurgents with a letter. Sources differ as to what this letter contained. According to the Poles, the false Dmitry invited the false prince to his place, promising possessions. According to the interrogation speeches of Moramets himself, the letter was written in very evasive terms, and it invited the impostor, if he is a true prince, to come to Moscow and provide evidence of this, and if not, to refrain from making further claims. As it turned out, the false Pyotr did indeed arrive in Moscow. However, when he eventually reached the city, it was too late. The false Dmitry would be no more. Almost from the beginning, a wave of discontent swept through the capital because of the Tsar's non-observance of church fasts and violation of Russian customs in dress and life, his disposition towards foreigners, his promise to marry a Polish woman, and the planned war with Turkey and Sweden. At the head of the discontented were Vasily Shoisky, Vasily Galitzin, Prince Kurakin, and the most conservative-minded representatives of the clergy, Metropolitan Hermogenes of Kazan and Bishop Joseph of Kolomna. The people were irritated by the fact that the Tsar more and more clearly mocked the Muscovite customs, dressed in foreign clothes, and seemed to deliberately tease the boyars, ordering to serve veal at the table, which the Russians did not eat. The prominent and long-established boyars were infringed upon by the number of so-called thinborns exalted by the new Tsar, including the relatives of the Queen and several clerks. It is believed that Vasily Shoisky did not hide his true thoughts, openly expressing in the circle of conspirators that Dmitry was put on the throne for the sole purpose of overthrowing the Godunovs, and now the time has come to overthrow him himself. Fulfilling his promise to marry Marina Mniszek, the impostor sent the clerk Afanasy Vlasov to Poland, and on the 12th of November 1605, in the presence of King Sigismund, he performed the rite of betrothal with her, at which he represented the royal groom. Sometimes it is believed that an additional factor that determined the impatience of the royal bridegroom was the Polish army, on whose loyalty he hastened to rely, feeling the precariousness of his position. The false Dmitry persistently invited Marina and her father to Moscow, but Yerzy Mniszek preferred to wait, probably not being absolutely sure that the future son-in-law was firmly seated on the throne. He finally decided to make the trip in the spring of 1606, alarmed by rumors that the false Dmitry had not let Xenia Godunova go for several months. On the 24th of April 1606, together with Yerzy Mniszek and his daughter, the Poles arrived in Moscow. Around 2,000 people, including nobles, lords, princes and their retinue, to whom the impostor additionally allocated huge sums for gifts. The ambassadors were presented with thoroughbred horses, golden washstands, forged gold chains, 13 glasses, 40 sable skins and 100 gold skins. 2 tents were pitched near Moscow for Marina and her retinue, and the Tsar presented his bride with a carriage decorated with silver and images of the Tsar's coats of arms. The carriage was harnessed to 47 gray horses covered with apples, and each was led by the bridles of the king's henchmen. The future Tsarina Marina was greeted by voivodes, princes and crowds of Moscow people, as well as an orchestra of tambourines and trumpets. Before the wedding, Marina was supposed to stay in the Resurrection Monastery with Tsarina Martha. Complaining that she could not bear the Moscow food, Marina managed to get the Tsar to send Polish cooks and kitchen servants. Dinners, balls, and festivities followed one another. The wedding was originally scheduled for the 4th of May 1606, but then postponed, as it was necessary to work out a ritual for at least the external adoption of Orthodoxy by Marina. Patriarch Ignatius, obedient to the Tsar, rejected Metropolitan Hermogenes' demand for the baptism of a Catholic. Moreover, Hermogenes was punished. The false Dmitry asked the Pope of Rome for special permission to commune and anoint the bride according to the Greek rite, but received a categorical refusal. Chrismation, as a rite to replace Marina's conversion to Orthodoxy, was nevertheless decided. On the 8th of May 1606, Marina Mniszek was crowned Tsarina and the false Dmitry's confessor Terenty performed the marriage ceremony. According to her own recollections, Marina went to the coronation in a sleigh with silver harness, upholstered in velvet decorated with pearls, with a hollow lined with sables presented by the groom. A red brocade carpet led to the church. The Tsar and Tsarina, dressed in the Moscow style in cherry velvet decorated with pearls, kissed the crown and crossed 3 times, after which Marina received chrismation according to the Greek rite, and was crowned. She was also presented with the symbols of power, a scepter and a cross. The impostor Tsar wore a crown and rich clothes. When leaving the church, as was customary, money was thrown into the crowd, which ended in an inevitable stampede and fight. On the 9th of May 1606, on St. Nicholas' Day, a wedding feast was appointed against all traditions, which continued the next day, and the Tsar treated the boyars to Polish dishes and again veal, which was considered filthy food in Moscow. This caused a murmur to which the impostor paid no attention. On the same day, to the indignation of Muscovites, the pastor of St. Michael's Lutheran Church, Martin Baer, delivered a sermon to the foreign guard, which had previously been allowed only in the German quarter. During the multi-day celebration, when up to 68 musicians played in the chambers, the false Dmitry withdrew from state affairs, and at this time the Poles who arrived in a drunken revelry broke into Moscow houses, threw themselves on women, robbed passers-by, shooting into the air in a drunken frenzy and shouting that the Tsar could not order them, since they themselves had put him on the throne. The conspirators decided to take advantage of this. On the 17th of May, at dawn, by order of Shoisky, the alarm was sounded on Ilyinka, and other sextons also began to ring, not yet knowing what was going on. The Shoiskys, Galitzin, and Tatashev entered Red Square, accompanied by about 200 men armed with sabers, axes, and horns. Shoisky shouted that Lithuania was trying to kill the Tsar and demanded that the townspeople rise up in his defense. The ruse did its job. The excited Muscovites rushed to beat and rob the Poles. It is believed that at least 524 Poles fell under the hammer of the Moscow revolt. Shoisky entered the Kremlin through the Spasskaya Gate, with a sword in one hand and a cross in the other. Dismounting near the Dormition Cathedral, he venerated the image of the Vladimir Mother of God, and then ordered the crowd to go against the evil heretic. Awakened by the ringing of bells, the false Dmitry rushed to his palace, where Dmitry Shoisky told him that Moscow was on fire. The impostor tried to return to his wife to calm her down and then go to the fire, but the crowd was already breaking down the doors. Basmanov, who was the last one left with the Tsar, opened the window, demanded an answer, and heard demands to surrender. During this time, the clerk Timofey Osipov, who was entrusted with the duty of swearing allegiance to the new Tsarina, was preparing for the inevitable, and having penetrated into the royal bedchamber, he allegedly said to the Tsar,
"You order yourself to be written in titles and letters of invincibility, Caesar, but according to our Christian law to our Lord Jesus Christ, the word is rude and disgusting, but you are a true thief and heretic. The Shira is Grishka Otrepiev, and not tsarevich Dmitry."
However, there is an opinion that this whole story is nothing more than a patriotic legend, and as Osipov had entered the palace to stab the false Dmitry in his sleep, he did not have time to make speeches. One way or another, it is known for certain that Osipov was killed by Pyotr Basmanov and his corpse was thrown out of the window. Then, according to eyewitnesses, in the confusion, not finding his sword, the false Dmitry snatched the halberd from one of the guards and approached the door. Basmanov went down to the porch and tried to persuade the crowd to disperse, but was stabbed in the chest. The false Dmitry locked the door, and when the conspirators began to break it down, he ran down the corridor and climbed out of the window, trying to go down the woods to hide in the crowd, but stumbled and fell into the courtyard, where he was picked up by the archers who were on guard. The Tsar was unconscious, with a sprained leg and a shattered chest. The archers poured water on him, and when he came to his senses, he asked for protection from the conspirators, promising them the estates and property of the rebellious boyars, as well as the families of the rebels into servitude. The archers carried him in their arms to the devastated and plundered palace, where they tried to protect him from the conspirators who were eager to finish what they had begun. In response, the henchmen of Tatashev and Shoisky began to threaten the Streltsy to kill their wives and children if they did not give up the impostor. The archers, hesitating, demanded that Tsarina Maria Nagaya once again confirm that Dmitry was her son. The conspirators were forced to agree, but while the messenger went to Maria for an answer, they swore and threatened the false Dmitry and demanded that he give his real name, his title, and the name of his father, but the impostor insisted until the last moment that he was the son of Ivan the Terrible and that his mother's word would guarantee it. They tore off his royal dress and dressed him in some rags, poked his eyes with his fingers and pulled his ears. The returning messenger, Prince Ivan Galitzin, shouted that Maria had replied that her son had been killed in Uglich, after which shouts and threats rang out from the crowd, and the boyar's son, Grigory Valuev, jumped forward and fired at point-blank range.